In a perfect world, this movie would at least aim to be as high-minded as the original Ghost in the Shell. But this is Hollywood, and their views on machines and audiences keep their aims low. Unlike the original movie, this doesn't challenge the idea of ghosts or souls being something exclusive to humans, it doesn't contemplate identity in any new or interesting ways for Hollywood, and it doesn't even present an AI in any real sense. The main character's struggle, instead of being about the identity crisis of a full-body cyborg in a world with changeable memories and intelligent AI wanting to merge with you, has been whittled down to more or less exactly what the lines in the trailer made me think. A very standard Hollywood story that lacks any real substance from Ghost in the Shell. Having said that, in every other respect, this movie is a near best-case scenario for a live-action Hollywood adaptation of Ghost in the Shell that could realistically be made. It's an extremely mixed bag. Let's get into the people involved first. The director has made one prior movie that I haven't seen, so not much I can say about him. Not a great sign here, but it doesn't necessarily mean much. I'm more concerned about the writers, which in this case happen to be a lot more interesting. Jamie Moss gets top writing credit, and she has only written one movie before this, Street Kings from '08. I saw it just to get an idea of her writing before the movie came out, and I have to say I really liked it. It's very well written and a very good movie overall. It stars Keanu Reeves. I'm shocked I hadn't heard of it yet. She was third writer on this, but it's still a very good sign, and after I saw Street Kings, my expectations had definitely been bumped up a bit for Ghost in the Shell. As for William Wheeler, the second writer, I haven't seen any of his stuff, but just the fact that he wrote for projects like The Reluctant Fundamentalist and Queen of Katwe, I have no idea if I said that right. It's a very good sign, considering the kinds of stories they are. I can't recall when I last checked the writing credits for the live-action Ghost in the Shell movie, but I don't recall Aaron Kruger being on the list. His position as third writer reflects this, as he was probably brought in late for minor work on it. He wrote a few of the Transformers movies, but he also wrote The Ring, and he's apparently slated to write for the live-action version of Dumbo. Not too bad. Considering how good the first two writers look to me, I would hope to get something at least on par with Street Kings. It was a well-structured movie with a well-done twist, and that's about what we got, though I would recommend Street Kings over their version of Ghost in the Shell for sure. This movie has a lot of problems. Don't get me wrong. But for what it is, I think they did as good of a job as they could. It's as if you took good writers and made them work with all these stipulations the executives probably forced them to go by that handicap the movie's substance out of the gate. Visually and musically, the film is great. I have only minor nitpicks like the fact that the holographic displays on buildings feel more like they're ripped from Blade Runner than Ghost in the Shell. They shouldn't be there, but thankfully you aren't looking at them too often. There's a lot of recreations and nods to scenes in the franchise, but thankfully none of them feel out of place, which is pleasantly surprising. The performances are all around good. If you haven't seen the stream I linked a few months ago on my social media, then just know that my position on the casting controversy is the exact same as Max Landis's. Oh, she even said the Major is a cyborg with an artificial body and an assumed name anyway, so complaining about Johansson playing her makes no real sense. No duh. I can only really recommend this movie to super fans of the franchise who will already see it no matter what I say or anyone else says, or people who just want to see every action movie that comes out. It's not a movie that's about AI questioning identity in anything more than a superficial way, or one that questions the soul at all, but aside from that, it's a solid movie. Box office wise, you could consider it kind of a flop. It might break even, best case scenario. Johansson has alluded to the fact that it's probably going to be something under her belt she'd consider a failure, particularly domestically, whereas it's not doing so bad in Japan. If you ask them, in fact, they not only don't care that Johansson is playing the Major, they actually like her in her role as the Major. The critics over here, of course, are tearing it apart, usually for the right reasons of removing a lot of the quiet moments and the substance and mostly turning it into an action movie. But in my opinion, I think it still delivers a bit better than what Rotten Tomatoes currently has it ranked at. It's marginally better than a totally average action movie, I suppose. I mean, I might even give it closer to like a 60%. Though I think Anthony Lane's review blurb on Rotten Tomatoes is pretty spot on. Also, the Boston Globe's review stub. Can't really argue with that one. So let's get into my scene-by-scene breakdown. Spoilers from here on out. I'll have an annotation to skip to my final thoughts. We start with some opening text that seems to be similar to the original movies, but near the end of it, I think we get a solid indication that this movie not only doesn't care about AI, but still thinks that humans are inherently better able to think about certain things than AI. It's not terribly obvious, but I can read it clear as day. The opening scene is the first of many borderline shot-for-shot recreations of scenes from the original movie, in this case the making of a cyborg sequence from the original movie. However, this time it's the opening scene and not the second scene. This strikes me as not the best idea because now we have to wait for the next scene to have the original opening action sequence, which is a much better hook to start your movie. Considering how they changed the dialogue in that scene, though, I can kind of understand their choice, but I think it's ultimately still to the movie's detriment. After ScarJo wakes up, we get some basic exposition from the scientist Olette establishing that they supposedly saved her brain from her dying body after a terrorist incident, and they needed it to make her the first brain in a full-body cyborg. Then we get a real heavy-handed exchange between Olette and Cutter, the CEO of Hanka Robotics Corporation, that shows that the movie firmly believes machines can't think like people, which is why they used her brain, and that Cutter's just concerned with making her into a weapon. Not only is that terrible on its own, but the fact that the movie is cutting straight from exposition to the thematic statement in the movie shows that it isn't really concerned with building up any other elements of the movie through its dialogue. The next scene feels like an amalgamation of the shootout from the first episode of Standalone Complex, because of the robot geishas, and of course the opening shootout from the original movie. The setup this time is that the geishas at a Hanka conference have been hacked by the movie's villain Kuze, and the Major bursts in through the windows to take them down. Note, I have not seen the second season of Standalone Complex as of this recording, but I have the distinct impression he only shares the name of the villain of the second season of Standalone Complex, and nothing else. Before the shootout goes down, however, two characters at the conference, much like the original movie, are actually talking about things relevant to the plot. Although, in this case, it's more on-the-nose thematic dialogue that to me just seems a bit inorganic. After the shootout, there's a line from Bato about how the Major is different from the robot geishas after one of them asks to be spared instead of shot, which reveals just how clunky this movie is going to be with her character and how little it cares about showing AI in any kind of serious way. After that scene, we get the Major waking up like in the original movie in her room. If, like the original movie, she woke up following the making of a cyborg sequence, it would have been a nicer touch since we would have inferred the sequence was of her dreaming. Another thing I really should mention here that bothers me is that in the original movie we don't actually see her room, it's just all in shadow. But here we see it empty. This really shows visually, I think, where the movies differ with the Major's character. In this version, she feels largely empty instead of like a larger character that we only see parts of. I mean that both in the negative connotation and as a clearly intentional choice for their version of her character here. A scene that this movie really needed to show her character a bit more early on would have been the van scene between her and Togusa. Although the dialogue would have had to be reworked a bit more, it still would have helped a lot. She has her first hallucination and then takes a drug before leaving her apartment for Section 9 for the debriefing from the shootout. Near the start of the next scene, we finally get some nice banter between two of the Section 9 agents. The dialogue is basically taken from Motoko and Bato's dialogue at the lake scene from the original movie, where they muse about the fact that their enhancements allow them to sober up instantly. In this case, one of the agents is talking about how he finally was able to afford an artificial liver, and Togusa chimes in about how he's fine being completely human. Now this was great, it showed some character and world building, and even though Togusa being completely human never comes up again in this movie, it's still a nice touch. We get some exposition about how the villain Kuze is picking off people from Hanka Robotics. Aramaki invites the Major into his room to make it clear that she shouldn't think of herself as a weapon. This movie should have been about 20 minutes longer because it really needed more breathing room for these on-the-nose scenes about the Major's character and the theme they're going for. There's a quick scene of the Major and Bato en route to their destination. Bato feeds dogs in an alley, and of course one of them is a basset hound to allude to Oshi's dog of choice that Bato has in the second movie. What little character building dialogue there is in this scene feels too minimal to me. The Major visits Olette and talks about the hallucinations she's had 2 of by now while her arm gets repaired. She asks how Olette knows what's a glitch and what's her in her data, and Olette says the texture of the code is different. Okay, yeah, this is clearly going to go somewhere. I get it. There's some clunky dialogue trying to raise a privacy issue, even though not a minute previous to this, Major has to consent to having the data in her brain changed. So, why doesn't she have to consent for it to be viewed then? The movie routinely makes a big deal of the Major having to consent to changes in her data. like they're trying to make some kind of stance on memory changes, but like I just demonstrated, it's written too inconsistently, and it's just not a focus of the movie, so it feels really tacked on. We get some dialogue about the Major feeling disconnected from everything else because she doesn't feel like she has a past because she can't remember anything, and Olette gives the first iteration of the really stupid theme of the movie, that memories don't define us, our actions do. So apparently our actions aren't based on the past or our interpretation of it at all. That's the most incomprehensible version of free will I have ever heard. Next, Bato and the Major go to dive into one of the robot geishas to get a clue about Kuze. The Major only decides to do a risky dive because it'd be the fastest way to find Kuze, and she seems to be obsessed with finding him. I don't exactly feel like she should be at this point in the movie, but they try to explain it a little later. There's clearly a parallel trying to be set up between the Major and this robot geisha specifically. It's the one that asked to be spared and that she shot, and now she's going to dive into it. The scientist in the room even refers to the geisha as being ripped up and repurposed. Hint, hint. Also, the scientist is a strong reference to Haraway from the second Ghost in the Shell movie, considering her cigarette, ashtray, and that she uses the same kind of neural interface right in her eyes. The Major finds a location from the hack that brings her to a Yakuza-run club, which I'm pretty sure is at least somewhat referencing the Yakuza hideout that Bato visits in the second movie. It's a trap, and Bato ends up taking an explosion to the face, which necessitates him getting the cyborg eyes he normally has in the movie and show. Yet again, we get a scene of Olette talking to the Major being rebuilt after the explosion that she just also took. There's an effort to set up the Major's decisions to go against orders like her diving into the geisha as bad, at least according to all of her superiors. Thematically, of course, this makes sense since we know her struggle is about defining herself apart from her memories and also apart from being a weapon. Olette drops the line, though, that she can protect her body but not her mind. Jesus, has this movie fallen so far from the original? That statement doesn't make any sense whatsoever in the movie's universe. We have already seen that she can dive into a cyber brain and it's explicitly called a download. Are we supposed to believe that backups do not exist in this world? Major even makes my point for me, saying, well, if you can see all my thoughts, why can't you secure them? And Olette just dodges this with a line about how everyone will eventually become like her. That has nothing to do with what she just said. Not really. And the Major says that makes her feel alone. Soon after, we get a scene showing Cutter, the cartoonishly evil character that he is, threatening Aramaki that if anything happens to the Major, like could have happened after the geisha dive, he will burn Section 9, and Aramaki remarks that he only takes orders from the Prime Minister. Now, I don't really have a problem with Cutter being the one-note villain that he is. That's fine. He serves his function. I'm just disappointed Aramaki doesn't get to do much in this movie, and his dialogue and part has been significantly dumbed down compared to the original movie. Next, we get a very weird scene of Major seemingly exploring her sexuality and lack of feeling human by just touching a woman. It's short, not exactly bad, but we could have had something better, I suppose, here. Though arguably, it's somewhat inspired by her fun times in the manga, I guess. Next, Kuze knocks off the scientist who found details on Project 2571 in the hard drive of the geisha, and we get some cryptic dialogue that shows the scientist knows who he is. It's another nice nod to the original movie that the project is close in number to the Puppet Master's project. They just changed the 0 to a 7. The Major arrives at the scene afterwards and finds the data showing a list of scientists who worked on Project 2571 and surmises that Olette being on the list is probably about to be knocked off next by Kuze. What follows is a scene that's very similar to the original movie's ghost hack trash truck driver with the SMG, except this time his objective is to try and get information from Olette about Project 2571. The Major stops him and apprehends him, though Bato has to stop her from beating him up even more. Then we get a scene that's similar to the ghost hacking reveal scene from the original movie where, in this version, the Major confronts the guy about his false memories. Visually, it's done with a boring flat shot of him in the interrogation room. I have no idea why they didn't do more of a shot-for-shot remake of the original scene. It would have been way more interesting, or they could have done something else. Though I suppose maybe they wanted it to be shorter because it has frankly way less importance in the movie here. Now, I'll get into this more later, but the fact that ghost hacking is shown in this movie too to be possible, as in, you can completely rewrite someone's memory, it completely contradicts the new story in this movie they made up for the Major. So I'm baffled as to why they included this scene if it just doesn't fit. The Major somehow notices that Kuze is still in the guy, and they trace his location. There's a brief dialogue exchange as Kuze mentions how he has been born more than once. Now, you would think this might allude to him being an AI like the Puppet Master, but no. God, no. As Section 9 storms his location, we see the Major come upon a bunch of people brain-linked to make a network. Now, I'm going to go on record and say this idea is completely stupid, even though it's used in Psycho-Pass, which is a show I highly recommend. Human brains being linked would be a shitty computer compared to an actual computer at this point in the future, especially. Finally, we get the scene of Kuze confronting the Major. Like the Puppet Master, he talks about examining the Major's code and being fascinated by her, but that's where the similarity ends. He reveals that he was one of the previous prototypes for her as the first brain in a full cyborg. They disassembled him when he was still conscious, and that shells apparently usually reject brains. So I've always hated this idea in sci-fi of brains or bodies rejecting artificial parts. It's even used in Deus Ex Human Revolution. I mean, from a story perspective, it makes sense. It can make the protagonist more special in that they can be one of the first people to have these kinds of augmentations for some intrinsic reason. But from a hard sci-fi perspective, it's total BS. There's no reason to think we'll have trouble with making cyborgs once we understand the fundamentals. And I mean, come on, we already have people with artificial limbs and even primitive neural interfaces right now. Sadly, Kuze's entire motivation is to find out what they stole from him in terms of memories, and he's just killing all the people involved in the project for self-defense, he claims. How boring. Major sees an image on his chest that reminds her of her hallucinations, and Kuze says he has had a similar problem. He tells her not to take the drugs because they actually suppress your original memories. Major stands there and lets him get away while she's reeling from this information, I guess. She confronts Olet about Project 2571, and Olet says there were 90-something previous experiments before the Major. Major asks where the bodies came from. Olet knows nothing, but reveals her memories of how she died were false and implanted to make her more likely to fight terrorists. The Major criticizes her for leaving Kuze to die and leaves. So this plot point about the bodies not coming from dying bodies makes no fucking sense. All you have to do is offer a lot of money if you absolutely want dying people, or just get organ donors from car crashes or something. It's just in the story to make the villain look evil, and it flies in the face of basic logic. Strangely, we get the diving scene at the lake next, though without any Puppet Master lines, of course. The Major says some similar lines about feeling scared when she dives in the lake, but that it feels real. This isn't such a bad repurposing of the lake scene considering what the plot changed to, but on the other hand it feels super out of place because it shows the Major as having a character trait like wanting to go diving, and frankly, she really hasn't had much character until now, so why start now? It just really sticks out to me. Major gets apprehended by Hanko Robotics, and Cutter of course says she was corrupted by a terrorist and needs to be discarded so they can move on to the next attempt. Cutter wants Olet to give an injection to kill the Major, but of course she feels sentimental and fakes it for long enough to free her. Olet drops the line that Major never had to consent to anything they did. Again, this is so dumb and just makes Hanka seem too cartoonishly stupid and evil in that they only pretended to give her rights. Cutter kills Olet because why not make him look even more evil? Cutter goes and tells Aramaki that the Major has gone rogue because of terrorist programming. She killed Olet and Hanka will hunt her down. Aramaki says if you kill her, you kill us, and he takes out his gun, knowing that he's going to get in a shootout with Hanka in his next scene. Major goes and visits her real mother with information she got from Olet before she died. Hollywood just lives to piss me off with minor details in this scene, like the fact that apparently the Major used to write manifestos about how technology is destroying the world according to her mother. Fuck you, Hollywood. Her mother also drops that the Major originally was apprehended for the project because she was a runaway, and that she was always fearless and wild, which apparently explains why she's so quick to disobey orders in the movie, I suppose. It's an otherwise strangely touching and well done emotional scene, actually. Everything from her mother remarking that the cat likes her to her mother saying she reminds her of her daughter, I think is perfectly fine. But when her mother asks who she is, she says she doesn't know but that she will return. Meaning that her arc isn't over because we still have to get through the climax. Hanka attempts to kill most of Section 9 in scenes somewhat reminiscent of the final episodes of the first season of the show, and it's implied they all survive. So for the climax, Major visits the site she's been having hallucinations of, the place she was apprehended by Hanka for the cyborg project. Turns out, as a normal human, she was originally named Motoko Kusanagi. She was Asian the whole time, guys, so all the SJWs can just go home and quit complaining, right? Yeah, I wish. Given the plot they were going for, this is a largely minor detail that was probably originally in here for fan service from the beginning. I don't think they necessarily had to have done this as a response to the casting backlash, and I think that no one who was angry over the casting choice is going to care that they did this. In fact, I wonder how many people who got angry about it even were going to see this movie and even did see this movie. It makes for a good reveal though, I suppose. Kuze shows up and she tells him his original name too. They conveniently were both runaways who knew each other, which explains why he was fascinated with her from the beginning. So we go from a fascination an AI had with a cyborg also struggling with her identity to a cyborg who just didn't know that he actually already knew the other cyborg. Disappointing. Then Kuze drops the E word again. He did it in his first confrontation with the Major as well, though I didn't mention it. By E word, I of course mean evolution. If anyone watching this video knows anyone in Hollywood, please tell them to stop using evolution in such a bullshit, dumbed down way. Tell them to consult someone. Anyone who can tell them they don't know what they're talking about. The original Ghost in the Shell movie never even used the word evolution. It's just so arrogant and stupid here, but it's clear that they're just reaching so hard to pretend that they care about the Puppet Master plot in the original movie when they really don't. Kuze makes an offer for the Major to join him in his brain-linked neural network before being cut off by a recreation of the tank scene from the original movie. It's not a bad recreation. Major defeats the tank without needing help from Bato, though, in this version. However, in this version, Major refuses to join with Kuze, only he gets shot, and Bato has a super simplified exchange with Major where he awkwardly asks if she's still in there, even though there was no merge in this version. I mean, they're trying to repurpose it to apply to the fact that she realized she used to be somebody else, but it definitely still feels out of place. Aramaki confronts Cutter, and after having gotten permission from the Prime Minister and the Major, kills him. The Major restates the stupid as hell theme of actions and not memories defining us, and the movie ends while giving us a callback shot of her wiping the thermoptic camouflage across her face, like at the end of the original opening scene from the original movie. So let's just go over the major problems again. The theme and story make no sense even by the movie's own rules. If ghost hacking is a thing and people's entire memories can be rewritten, then why is the Major special? Why do they have a problem with rewriting her memories that causes the glitches? The answer, of course, is that because she is the main character and no other reason. The movie just doesn't care to say anything about the soul, except that only humans have them, but not when it's inconvenient for the screenwriter to make scenes that are homages to the original movie, like the ghost hacking interrogation scene. AI isn't even a part of the movie, though they pretend it is, and Kuze's dialogue alluding to his neural network is weak and dumb compared to the Puppet Master's original dialogue. The Major's character feels empty as well, and for that matter, far more aggressive than the original character in all the action scenes. She's really not that similar a character, except for her struggle being vaguely similar to the one in the original movie on some superficial level. Also, let's stop and think why her character completely invalidates the theme of actions, not memories defining who you are. How come she was still having her hallucinations of her original memories? Why did she disobey orders when Hanka didn't want her to? Oh yeah, because of her original memories and not the false ones. So she still was doing things because of her memory. Henko Robotics and its CEO Cutter do very stupid, evil things because they're the villain and for no other reason. Like I said, they could have just paid people to use their brains for the experiments or gotten actual dying people for the project who were organ donors or something. I really wonder what it was like to be in the room with the executives and writers on this movie, who decided to not even attempt a story involving AIs and souls. Was it really because the executives thought it wouldn't be appealing enough to a mass audience? How much did the writers fight back? Would they even bother? Deadline has an excellent article explaining a lot of the reasons why the movie was a commercial failure. Things like high cost for a niche movie, no real executive oversight, flawed marketing, the casting controversy, and poor reviews. I think it really comes down to the fact that when they made this movie so high budget, they shafted themselves, because it necessitated them thinking they had to dumb down the story and cast Johansson in their minds, or they couldn't rationalize the cost. Though obviously I think the writing making very bad choices had the worst impact, and the article even alludes to the fact that the lack of real story on display in the trailer probably didn't help. Lots of movies can do very well even with poor reviews and controversy, so I'm not so sure how much that factors in, but those combined with a movie that feels like it's another regurgitation of Hollywood stories clearly sealed its fate. Not much else to say really, except that Hollywood continues its trend of being terrible with handling AI stories and adaptations of anything that's not a comic or popular book series. I will continue to talk about the Ghost in the Shell franchise in future videos, so don't worry. Thanks for watching.